the Dust Bowl influenced me greatly in a sense. I suppose more than anything simply because of subsequent illnesses, particularly pneumonia, double pneumonia that I ended up with. They called it dust pneumonia, but it was during that time that I experienced a black duster of, at 34, 35, I guess it was, but I can't remember the particular year, but we were approaching Amarillo, Texas. Now, we had had dust storms, and in those years, my mother would wash clothes and hang them out on the line, and sure enough, the dust would start blowing, or you would be sure that you had a clear day and that we could, and the wind wasn't blowing from, say, a carbon black plant. You remember that those were years of concern for washing and that sort of thing. And I was, as a little boy, relatively speaking, concerned. I couldn't understand the difference that I was telling Marcy. Whether the Depression came and then the Dust Bowl, or the Dust Bowl came and that caused the Depression. It was a confusion of a young mind, but I know that both were troubling the country as a whole, and certainly the panhandle of Texas and other areas, Kansas and Oklahoma as well. But I was, during that time that I was conscious of it, living in Pampa at that time. It was an oil boom town of sort, you know, and so there was a lot of activity in the sense that there was some business at hand. It wasn't as bad as some towns that did not have an industry like the oil field, but I just knew that dust blew and that times were not good. We watched Amos and listened to Amos and Andy and other Fibber McGee and Molly on the radio and that sort of thing, but the Dust Bowl really came into being for me when we were approaching Amarillo, Texas on this particular Sunday that we're remembering the anniversary of. And I was in the back seat of this car that we were riding with another couple and their little girl, and my mother and father in the back seat, and this wall of dust and dirt and hundreds and thousands of twisting, and I can remember this to this day, of static electricity was seemingly creating these balls of dust that were approaching, and yet the wind wasn't really blowing. It was just this approach of this dust that nobody ever had seen before. And I remember my mother saying, maybe this is the end of the world or something to that effect, because nobody knew what was exactly happening. But I recall, as a child, my mother saying, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And of course, naturally enough, you started you trying to find your hand, and you could not. It was blacker than black. It was pitch black. And then it lifted after a few minutes, 5, 10, 50, I don't know how long. I can't estimate time. But it began to lighten up, and you were looking around, and of course the car was filled with something, a haze of dust. And you suddenly were surrounded by other cars who had not hit each other, fortunately, but had pulled off the side of the road. Then I knew that that's what they were really talking about, but dust would come up in a storm-like fashion periodically. Not every day was full of dust. You had these intermittent times of clear days and pleasant weather and not too much wind and that sort of thing. But I know it was prevalent, and it was something that you had to experience and tolerate, and you began to accept it. It was also during that same time that I recall bread lines. It was Amarillo, Pampa had a little bread line too. You had difficulties. You knew that people were out of work. You people were riding, hobos riding, not hobos. They were forced to ride trains because they had no money. and they would get on the trains and ride through, and you'd see them. But it was during that period of time that I also managed to contract pneumonia, and it was during that same time of contraction of the pneumonia that I recall my mother trying to seal the home that we were in. It was a red house, but you know that you try to use newspapers and towels, wet them, and trying to seal around sills or windows and doors, and trying to keep out as best you could. Now, of course, that didn't keep the ceiling from seeping through, because there was an absence of insulation and seals of that do have today. That doesn't mean that we couldn't still have dust in the air, but it would permeated the house, and you would have a light bulb, and just like here, that bulb, you would be looking up there, but there'd be a haze of dust hanging around the ceiling and looking at, you know, it just grime and dust were a part of everyday life, in a sense. Not every day would it be bad. Some days would be better than others.